great information, particularly focused on the recent election. And I want to get into a little bit about what NDA is going to be looking at for 2021 with regard to legislative and regulatory priorities. And so before I get into the agenda, just to talk a little bit about what I want to cover, as Jeff mentioned, this year has been particularly unique. And from a government affairs perspective, I wanted to just provide a little bit of an update in terms of what NDA has been really focusing on over the last several months. So, when the COVID-19 pandemic really started taking hold, a lot of our priority was on a few things. One was the issue of critical essential infrastructure, which is another way that the federal government talks about essential businesses. And so we lobbied the federal government and the states for our members to be designated as essential businesses. And then the other side to it is the congressional lobbying that we engaged in to help our members on the business side of things navigate the pandemic. And that's where things like the Paycheck Protection Program come in, which we will talk about coming up. So we sent a lot of letters to Capitol Hill, talked with a lot of members of Congress on allocating money for the Paycheck Protection Program. We specifically asked for $349 billion dollars, and that's exactly what Congress authorized. So that was a big positive. And then a lot of some of the other things that we've done recently have been more around implementation of that program and others. So I just wanted to provide a very brief overview of just some of those things that are very COVID focused for 2021 and segue a little bit into the webinar into our 2021 priorities and what we might expect next year with regard to policy making, ranging from labor policy to infrastructure, et cetera. So let's get into it here. So this is essentially an outline of what I'd like to cover today. I'd like to talk about the election. We're going to go over the race for the presidency, the House, the Senate, and then we'll talk about NDA's priorities for next year. What I'd like to specify before getting into the election recap is just to reemphasize that NDA is a nonpartisan organization. We don't engage in endorsing political candidates or preferring one over the other. We're a membership organization that is purely focused on educating and advocating for educating members of Congress and regulatory agencies and advocating for the interests of our members. And so when we're presenting this information in this webinar here today, I just want to make it clear that none of the information here is a reflection of NDA's position on any particular candidates or political parties. So the first thing I'd like to do is just provide some initial overviews and takeaways from the election. The Democrats, broadly speaking, the way it's going to be looking is that they will take the White House. Now, I know there are some outstanding legal battles that are taking place, and the Electoral College has not met yet, but we are operating right now under the assumption that the president-elect is Joe Biden. And one of the reasons we're doing that as well is because NDA needs to engage with the transition team very early on. So we need to function as if that is the case now and engage with that transition team to get our organization in front of them. Now, if something drastic were to happen, we'd of course re-engage with the Trump administration. But I want to just that's the reason why we're talking in these terms, and we're not endorsing any candidates or anything like that. So that's for the White House. The Democrats were also able to keep control of the House of Representatives, although they did lose some seats, and we're going to get into a little bit about that and why that was. The Republicans, they're holding an advantage going into the January 5th runoff election in Georgia. You might have heard about this, and you might be familiar with some states having to go into a runoff election if there aren't enough votes to declare a winner. I think it's a particular margin has to be met. So the two Senate races in Georgia are going to go to a runoff election. The Republicans right now do have the advantage, but it is a close race. And if the Republicans win those seats, they will maintain control of the Senate. Mitch McConnell will remain the majority leader. If the Democrats were to pick up these seats, the Senate would be tied. So it'd be 50-50 split. And if Kamala Harris does get sworn in as the vice president, she would be de facto the president of the Senate and thus has the ability to cast tie-breaking votes. So it's a big deal for Georgia, and the Republicans right now seem to have the advantage. An interesting takeaway is that $14 billion were spent on campaigning, and this is double the amount of money that was spent in 2016, and that's a combination for president and House and Senate races, and it's a very large number, and it just goes to show you, I think, a lot of the polarization that took place in this election, and um, how both sides really were motivated to get the vote out. Now, I mentioned before that the Democrats did lose some seats, and um, there's several reasons for that, but a big part of it is some of the messaging that some more progressive Democrats were running with seem to have had a negative effect on many suburban voters and others, and they were not able to carry those races. And that could be disputed certainly by some who might say that's not the problem, but there are moderate Democrats who have been expressing concern over some of the language on the progressive wing of the party. So that's interesting to note, the fact that they were in a size pretty decent majority in the House, and they actually shrunk their majority down. So the Republicans did pick up seats. Of course, I do want to mention how the turnout for President Trump and just his results really conflicted with the national polls. And I think this does reflect a uniqueness for quote Trumpism, and it's really not a reflection of an endorsement by any means. It's just an interesting observation that the president seems to really defy pollsters in terms of they're not able to really grasp a lot of the support for the president, and that could be for several reasons. One could be technology challenges. There's some restrictions on pollsters and how they're able to collect information from potential voters, and calling people up these days is really not an option. A lot of people just they don't answer unknown calls, that kind of thing. But in addition, it could be really related to the fact that um, the supporters for President Trump really don't like talking to pollsters or or answering polls, and so they were a little bit closer this time, but still were off. And it's really interesting to note that, and just it's whether it's a phenomenon or just the new nature of polling, we'll have to see. But interesting nonetheless. So, talking about the lame duck session now, the lame duck session is the period of time after an election takes place until the new Congress is sworn in. So, we are in the lame duck session now, technically, because we're now after the election, and that will run through January. And the lame duck session is usually a period of time where there's kind of a big rush to do a few fairly large size items to get them done before the new Congress is sworn in. So next year, any legislation right now that is introduced, it will all get thrown out essentially. It all would have to be reintroduced when we start the new Congress in January. So a big focus right now, I think, for the lame duck session will be the potential for another COVID relief package. This is something that NDA has been lobbying on for the past several months. We've made the case for additional rounds of PPP money and employer liability protection, and several other things. So we'll see what comes from COVID relief. Tax extenders. This is just one of the larger things they could consider. It's not particularly a huge issue for NDA, but it's essentially a bunch of expiring tax credits and deductions in the tax code that if Congress doesn't act, they'll just expire. And so there'll be a big push from several other business groups to take up a tax extenders package. And then appropriations. So by the 11th of this month, Congress needs to pass another appropriations bill, or else government funding would run out. Although we really don't expect to see a big fight over government funding. So they'll likely pass a continuing resolution, which is just a piece of legislation that just reauthorizes money to keep the government funded. So that should be pretty neutral. And just a quick note about gridlock. I think it's safe to say that if the Republicans are able to maintain control of the Senate, they'll likely serve as a check on a lot of the Democratic actions that take place, whether it's legislation passed by Nancy Pelosi in the House, or if uh, Joe Biden is sworn in as president, on things like nominees, because nominees have to be confirmed by the Senate. So there's going to be just a lot of gridlock. However, that doesn't mean that we can't find some areas where there could be some paths forward. One example would be infrastructure, which I'll talk about shortly. But it's going to be difficult for legislation to move, and that could be good or bad depending on what the issue is. So just an observation there. Okay, so this is the projected electoral college map. Once again, these are observational figures and an observational map from NDA. We don't endorse any candidates, and this is not a reflection of a preference one way or the other. This is just to present to you the information as currently understood. And so some interesting some interesting notes would be that right now they're anticipating that Joe Biden will pick up the electoral votes for Georgia, and that would be a big flip for the Democrats to take. And also states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, those were won by President Trump in 2016. And so I know there's some ongoing issues regarding some legal battles and stuff, but in terms of the races being called, they were called for Biden. So that's another interesting takeaway. And Arizona as well going potentially going blue. And there was some issues with that race getting called early. But again, this is the lay of the land as we understand it right now. So this is the electoral college map that we anticipate will be the case when the electoral college meets. So moving on to the Senate, there are some interesting takeaways from the Senate races. Um, Obviously, I mentioned that in Georgia there are going to be the two runoff elections on January 5th that will determine who controls the Senate. A couple seats were flipped in several states. Firstly, in the state of Alabama, the Democrats actually did get a seat for a little while. Senator Doug Jones is the current senator from Alabama, and he famously beat Roy Moore for that seat after Jeff Sessions left to become President Trump's attorney general. The Republicans were able to pick that seat up. So that's Tommy Tuberville, who took that seat back from the Democrats. The Republicans picked up that seat in Alabama, but the Republicans lost two seats in Colorado and Arizona. So Senator Cory Gardner in Colorado, Republican, lost his race to John Hickenlooper, who's the current governor of Colorado. And then Senator Martha McSally, Republican from Arizona, lost to Mark Kelly. A lot of the other races were pretty expected, for the most part. There really weren't any other surprises, other than maybe some people were thinking that Senator Susan Collins from the state of Maine might lose her seat. It was a very competitive race, but she was able to hold on to that seat in Maine. The rest of the states are either pretty solid red or pretty solid blue, so that not too surprising. And here's just some names that are the new senators from these states that either they defeated an incumbent or somebody wasn't running for reelection, and this will be the new senator. We have Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona. I mentioned took Martha McSally's seat. Cynthia Loomis will be the senator from Wyoming. She's a current member of the House of Representatives. Ben Ray Lujan, same thing, Democrat from New Mexico. John Hickenlooper, current governor of Colorado. Tommy Tuberville, I think many people are probably familiar with him and his career as a football coach. So he will take Doug Jones' seat and give the Republicans back that Senate seat. Roger Marshall will pick up the open seat in Kansas, so that stays in the Republicans' hands, and Bill Hagerty will take that seat in Tennessee. There actually will have to be an appointment made in California if Kamala Harris is sworn in as the vice president. And so Governor Gavin Newsom would appoint someone to the seat to finish out her term in office. And then we have the two Georgia runoffs, which we'll see how those play out. Moving on to the House of Representatives. This is very hard to read, so it's just more of a visual representation. I'll get into some specifics on the next slide. But this is a representation of the congressional districts around the United States. And it actually is interesting to look at because you really get a sense of where the concentrations are of, liberal, conservative. You really get an interesting sense of just how that looks on the national map. And a lot of times you see this as just broken up by state, but this is showing you the congressional districts. And so of course in some of the more western mountain states, if you look at Wyoming for example, you'll see that that's just a quote at large seat. So there's only one uh, congressional seat there, so it's the entire state. But then when you go to a state like Texas or New York or California, there are lots and lots of seats. So just an interesting representation there. For the House, the Democrats have 219 seats, Republicans 204. I think I mentioned before the Democrats did lose some seats to the Republicans. And really, it comes down, I think, to some of the messaging from the progressive side of the Democratic Party. This is what a lot of voters were saying in those districts, that it turned them off, and they went with the Republicans. And so the Democratic majority shrunk. Nancy Pelosi is expected to maintain her speakership. There's really no one right now who's planning to challenge her for that role as speaker. And just as an FYI, the youngest member who was elected to the House is 25 years old. That is the youngest age that you can be to take office in the House of Representatives. You can be a congressman at 25, you can be a senator at 30, and you can be the president at 35. So just interesting there. And every few years there is somebody 25, 26 years old who is sworn in and sometimes breaks the record. But yeah, the youngest member will be 25. So I'd like to just shift gears a little bit. And I mentioned that we're certainly not endorsing any candidates. And this is not our discussion of a quote Biden administration is not a reflection of our endorsement of Biden. It's really more of it's helpful for us to start engaging with the information that we have regarding the election so that we can talk to the transition team that's already getting in place and make sure that NDA is really front and center so that if Biden is sworn in as president, then we have a leg up with some of the key staff. So that's the context that I'd like to talk about a potential Biden administration and some of the issues. So talking about the transition staff, we're going to be reaching out to them early. We've already requested a meeting with the transition team. So NDA is looking to do that. We'll also be sending a letter that's going to be drafted shortly or finished drafting shortly. And it's going to outline NDA in terms of what we are as an organization, who we represent, and some of the really important key issues um, that our organization stands for and is passionate about. So we're going to be really trying to engage with them very early. And then, like I said, if Biden is sworn in, then we really want to engage that administration very early on. I think it's fairly safe to say that one of the things that he would likely do is rescind several executive orders that President Trump had signed. I wanted to give a couple examples just to, particularly on the regulatory side, just to frame this. One of the executive orders you probably heard about, it was signed shortly after President Trump was sworn into office. One of this first one on your screen is called the Reducing Regulation and Controlling Regulatory Costs. This is the quote 2-for-1 executive order that Trump signed. This is a requirement that if an agency is going to be passing a significant regulation, they have to get rid of two other regulations to do that. So that's something that Biden is not going to be supportive of. Democrats are typically much more favorable toward the ability for agencies to regulate as they see fit. So that will likely go out the window. And even the same thing with the other one, Executive Order 13924, which is regulatory relief to support economic recovery. This is an executive order that Trump signed to provide regulatory relief for businesses because of COVID, right? So there's a lot of challenges with COVID that businesses are facing, and Trump came in and said, "I don't think we, should have to, um, or we should provide some relief to some of these regulations where appropriate to help businesses navigate the pandemic." And we're going to see others as well that range from all different kinds of issues. And following, I think, a precedent. that was set, and this was something that Obama did too. I think what's going to happen is if Congress does not pass legislation at the speed in which they would like Congress to, which they might be very slow because of a gridlock situation if the Republicans keep the Senate, I think you're going to see a lot of support and use of executive orders by Biden. The other thing is going to be nominating political appointees. This is a big function for a new administration. Now, if you're a political appointee, either you're cabinet level or there are levels just below that, which are, quote, political appointees, meaning these people to fill the role in that regulatory agency, like the Department of Labor, for example, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. And that's going to pose, if the Republicans are in control of the Senate, that will pose a challenge to the Biden administration in terms of trying to push progressive picks for certain positions, because Republicans are going to serve as kind of a quote check on a lot of those nominees, and they control the Judiciary Committee, they control the floor, so they can hold up seats as long as they want. And so that process of nominating political appointees will be certainly one to watch. We'll be looking for some of the positions within the Department of Labor, OSHA, who the administrator of the EPA will be, um, Department of Transportation, several others too. So that's something we'll be monitoring. So now I want to get into some specific policies that have been proposed by Biden, just to give some information about what he's thinking. Now, I want to make it clear too that these are policy proposals, so they're not things that would pass necessarily, or that he would have to get some bipartisan support for these things. Some of them will not get bipartisan support, some of them will. So these, just so you know, are not these aren't like set in stone or anything like that. These are just proposals that have been made that are good reference points for us when we're looking at the administration. So on economics and tax, he's very much in favor of raising tax rates on top earners. So they've thrown around the $400,000 level, in terms of repealing the Trump tax cuts that were passed in 2017. He would like to raise the corporate tax rate back up. That was also cut in 2017 by President Trump, and increasing that top rate back to 39.6, and that was cut again in 2017. So there'll be a focus on that, and I think it's safe to say that the House of Representatives at least will be pursuing that type of tax policy. But if the Republicans control the Senate, they won't get that through. He also wants to lift the cap on payroll taxes, increase in capital gains and estate tax, create a true minimum tax. I'm not really sure that he hasn't really been specific about that for multinational corporations. So some of these things are very general, and they would require some additional fleshing out. An important one here that I'd like to talk about is infrastructure. Infrastructure is a priority for NDA, and we've been in our communications to the Hill and the administration, and in our upcoming 2021 edition of the National Policy Agenda. Infrastructure is a big one that we are really spending a little bit more time with, and making the case a little bit more that infrastructure is a big deal. And this is something that he could get bipartisan support on. There is consensus among Democrats and Republicans for infrastructure. Some of their proposals look different, of course, but that general consensus of we should do something on infrastructure seems to be um, relatively agreed upon. So just a couple things that I think are worthy to mention. He's proposing 50 billion in just the first year to fund repairs to roads, highways, bridges, things like that. So very transportation focused there. One of the things that we would be very happy to see is the expedited project permitting. That's been one that has industry groups, including NDA, have been making the case for that. This would be a welcomed change. Um, the permitting process right now is pretty long, and it's a lot of regulatory burden there. So the fact that he has come out and expressed openness to that is a good sign. It's like I said, it's very transportation focused. So there's looking at new revenue sources for the Highway Trust Fund. That could come in the form of taxes in some way. In terms of a proposal, again, not set in stone, but that could be what he proposes. He's interested in high-speed rail, and I don't know how much support that will get. And then apprenticeship programs that I thought were interesting as well. Fund new apprenticeship readiness programs that specifically target veterans, women, communities of color to enter the construction trades that are connected to registered apprenticeships. And NDA has submitted comments in the past to the administration and Congress as well on apprenticeships. So that's something we would like to engage with them on and be a part of as they work to craft that policy. I really wanted to take a moment and focus on some of the labor policy because I know that's probably top of mind for a lot of people. Um, there's there's a piece of legislation called the PRO Act that the Democrats in the House were very much in favor of. It's a you could call it a very progressive labor bill. You know, it's a very it's supported by many Democrats, particularly some on the progressive side, and it's a lot of just laundry list that you might see from a lot of the progressive side or the pro union side. Um, Again, not making an endorsement on unions there, just commenting on the um, the approach that they're taking to labor policy. You know, some of the provisions that he's proposed are banning employers mandatory meetings with their employees in which employees are forced to listen to anti-union messaging, um, reinstatement of the persuader rule, which requires employers to report not only information that's communicated to employees, but also the activities of third-party consultants who are working, maybe for an employer. Um, Codifying the law, the NLRB rules for shortened timelines for elections, allow workers to form unions if a majority signs authorization cards. So some of the stuff will sound familiar. This is stuff that has been championed by Democrats for quite a while. Uh, he wants to also go back to the broad definition for the joint employer status, go back on the Trump administration's new rules on overtime pay. He does support the increase in the federal minimum wage to $15. And so these are the things that NDA, I think, will be engaging in once we see this type of policy shape up. And one of the ways that NDA maintains our or works to be effective in Washington is both our standalone lobbying efforts, and this would be an example that we would be getting involved with, but also the way in which we work with other organizations. So we have relationships with a variety of other construction trade groups that collectively work on a lot of things to try to unite together on, being a voice for the construction industry. And so we'll be working with them as well on a lot of these types of policies because I know this is probably going to start heating up next year, particularly in the House of Representatives. So NDA is going to be engaged on that pretty early. So just talking about back to the lame duck session for a minute, I wanted to just give some information about the House and Senate with regard to COVID relief and some of the things that NDA would be paying attention to for COVID relief legislation coming up in the next several weeks if it does. So NDA, we've been lobbying Congress on another COVID relief bill and what to include in it if they were to consider a piece of legislation. One of them that we'd like to see is an employer liability protection. This would be COVID specific and it would provide a 5-year employer liability shield for employers that are acting in good faith. So that would be following all uh, health and safety regulations and guidance, basically protecting the good actors, quote, from frivolous lawsuits. So the Senate, Senate Republicans are very much in favor of that 5-year employer liability protection. The Democrats are really not so much. They'd like to have, they have several other priorities. So that's something that we're going to be continuing our messaging on. Direct payments to individuals, this is something that they seem to agree on, although the most recent proposal from the Senate seems to exclude those direct payments. But several Republican senators have expressed support for direct payments, and this was direct money in the form of cash that was sent out to Americans making less than $99,000 a year. There was a phase down once you got above 72,000. So the direct payments is something that could still come up, even though the Senate proposal recently excluded it. PPP funding is also something that they do agree on, although one of the big things that's a variable is the amount of money that they both would allocate. The House is proposing to allocate a lot of money. As you can see on the screen, it says 2.2 trillion. That's the size of the House bill that did pass. That's another COVID relief bill. The Senate has not passed another one yet since the CARES Act, which NDA was lobbying on before that passed. And so uh, PPP funding is going to be one of the important things we'd like. Currently, currently the program is quote it's expired in the sense that they're not taking new applications. So it needs to be reauthorized by Congress and given some more money. So we would support that. The federal unemployment issue as well is a big one. Now, in previous COVID relief legislation, you might be familiar with the fact that they passed a $600 supplemental unemployment benefit. So that would be in addition to the benefits that somebody was getting on unemployment. So it was X amount of dollars plus $600 per week. So every week it was another $600. Now, NDA wants a balanced solution that makes sure workers are protected and have some resources to navigate the pandemic, but it has to be workable. We need to have a fair system that does not overly burden employers, taxpayers, and whatnot. So NDA supports a reduction in that level for both fairness reasons in terms of the amount, but also we don't want to see any issues with regard to labor availability and the administration of supplemental unemployment benefits. So there's that balance. I think that NDA is striking with regard to our position on the unemployment. We're not opposed to it flat out. It's more of a we'd like to see a balance. So the Senate proposal right now for the supplemental unemployment would be 300. So it'd be significantly less than was previously passed at the $600 level. The House Democrats would like to see the $600 just continue for a while. That probably won't happen, but they're pretty adamant about that. So we'll see how it shakes out with regard to supplemental unemployment. And then the last one, this is a Democratic priority, is aid to state and local governments. And what the Democrats would like to see is money going directly to these municipal governments, state governments, so that they can use the money for different things. The Republicans have concerns about this because this money would just go to a lot of cities and other states even that have very poorly run financials over however long, could be a few years or it could be several, and that it would essentially function as a bailout. Maybe they uh, really overextended on pensions or something. And the Republicans are concerned that it would serve as a bailout for some of those municipalities and state governments. So that's something that the Republicans are concerned about the number there. So the point of all of that is to say there's some disagreement over this between the Republicans and Democrats. There are some areas of agreement, which is positive, but for months now, they actually have not been able to find common ground in the sense of putting a bill together and putting it up for a vote. So it's something that we're going to be continuing to watch and lobby on. And but yeah, they'll have to come together to really try to pass something if that's what they want, which they both sides say they do. It's more of working together and finding that agreement. I mentioned tax extenders, but it's more of just an FYI in terms of another issue that they might consider. There really aren't a significant amount of tax extenders that NDA would be particularly concerned about. A lot of the tax extenders are related to personal taxes. For example, one of them is a tax credit that deals with upgrading the windows in your home. So there's all kinds of different unique tax credits and deductions that are in the tax code and that have expiration dates. And so there'll be some that come up and expire at the end of this year. So they might consider taking up a bill to extend those. And then I mentioned appropriations. They have to fund the government by December 11th. And again, we don't expect really much concern there. So um, before I go into some of the other actions or other things I'd like to discuss with regard to NDA's action and some of the things we'll be doing, I wanted to provide just a brief update on the Paycheck Protection Program. I know that it's a particularly important program for several members, and NDA's position is we like to see our members have options with regard to keeping their business functioning and giving them the ability to do what they'd like with a program like the Paycheck Protection Program. So as I mentioned, they are not currently accepting new applications, but for those who do have a PPP loan or are thinking about it even moving forward if they reauthorize it, we communicated this back in June, but they released the loan forgiveness application and instructions. Now, if if you are if you have a Paycheck Protection Program loan, you're probably familiar with the fact that if you use the money for specific things, for example, payroll for your employees, that amount of money is eligible for forgiveness. So you don't have to pay that money back. However, you have to apply to uh, essentially to SBA to have that money forgiven. And so there's an application and instructions that were released by SBA, and they released quote an easy application. So they tried to simplify this for particular businesses to make it a lot easier rather than having to deal with a mountain of paperwork just trying to get some support from the Small Business Administration. And so you can use the easy application for loan forgiveness if you're self-employed, independent contractor, sole proprietor with no employees, um, borrowers who did not have a salary, an hourly wage reduction, and an FTE reduction, and borrowers who did not have a salary, and hourly wage reduction, and are unable to operate during the covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th of this year due to compliance with requirements established between March 1st and December 31st of this month. So um, NDA has a COVID resource center on our website. So we have information about the Paycheck Protection Program and the guidance that's been issued so far up on our website. So if you'd like information about that, our website will help you with some of the information needed on applications, loan forgiveness, criteria, qualification criteria, frequently asked questions, that kind of thing. So just wanted to specify that as well. Now, I wanted to get a little bit more specific with regard to um, some of the things that we'll be looking at in the lame duck, and this is more of a um, oops, excuse me. This is more of just a recap. I apologize in advance. The Department of Labor slide should actually have a few more bullets on there, but I can still talk about it. That's fine. So I talked about some of the SBA stuff with PPP. What we'd like to do is get an exemption from the Small Business Administration with regard to a business being required to certify the necessity for high dollar PPP loans. So essentially, they've come out and said if you're taking out a loan of I think it's $2 million and above, you need to provide an additional certification requirement that the loan was necessary. And we think that's a little bit of that makes it duplicative. You already have to provide a certification that the loan is being made in good faith and all that kind of stuff. So that's something we'd like to see. And just generally speaking, increase regulatory streamlining for small businesses. We want to make sure our members do not have to get buried in a mountain of paperwork and confusing regulations. Of course, certain regulations uh, are needed, but we want to make sure that they're as easy as possible to comply with and understand, and that kind of thing. Now, with regard to the Department of Labor, um, the OSHA crane rule, beryllium, silica, these are all things that NDA follows and pays attention to. I apologize, I didn't list the other ones in a bullet. But um, because of COVID, a lot of the regulatory activity at the Department of Labor, and for that matter, the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies, has really slowed down because the agencies went into kind of a COVID compliance assistance posture. They not that they're not working on regulations, but it's much more slow with regard to some of their rulemakings. For example, we were expecting to see an updated final rule on crystalline silica in construction and updates to Table 1. NDA did submit comments to OSHA with regard to recommended updates to Table 1 that pays a little bit more attention to demolition. And they actually pushed that back to next year. So we would be seeing that next year. And it's the same thing for powered industrial trucks, lockout, tagout, and several others that NDA is watching. So they pushed a lot of things into next year, which is fine. And our once some of these things come out with regard to proposed rules or whatever it is, then we are going to um, weigh in as needed and particularly engaging with if there's a new administration, engaging with the Department of Labor and other agencies. And then congressional lobbying is going to come down to COVID relief, essentially. So we have additional PPP funding, employer liability protections. I was talking about that, the scaled back unemployment benefits, and we'll be paying attention to a tax extenders package just to check if there's any particulars in there that would affect demolition. Excuse me, would affect demolition. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. Um, last slide, and then I would be happy to open it up for questions. Um, Before I do my last slide, just if you would like to um, ask a question, you can use the chat box. So there's a chat function in the Zoom controls, and if you have a question, please feel free to type it there, and we'll try to answer that. So early 2021, NDA, we really want to make sure that we really engage early. And that's going to include, I talked about the transition team before, but we also want to engage with some of the really important committees that we either work with or cover the issues that NDA is affected by. That's going to include the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the Senate Finance Committee. They deal with tax policy, Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee. Ways and Means deal with tax policy, Education and Labor in the House. These are important committees for NDA, and what we're going to be doing is engaging with them in early 2021, just to make sure that they, because there will be some turnover with some congressional staff and whatnot. So we want to make sure that if there's new staff, we're engaging with them, that they know about NDA, and that they can come to us to consult and advise with them when they're considering policy, and the Biden transition team as well. And we also want to build relationships early on with the typical agencies that NDA does work with. That's the Department of Labor, EPA, Department of Transportation, Office of Management and Budget, and there'll be some others. But over the past several years, one of the things we've been trying to do a lot of is really boosting some of our relationships with agencies. Now, sometimes their pace is a little slow with certain things, but we've been reaching out to them, engaging with them, and just making sure that they see NDA as the organization that represents the demolition industry. So that is something that will be a priority for us in 2021 with these agencies and some others, and just making sure those relationships are solidified as strong early on. So with that, what I'd like to do is take a pause for any questions. Like I said, you can use the chat function within your Zoom controls, but I also wanted to put our email addresses on here. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at any time. We'd be happy to talk anytime about anything you'd like. So I'll pause there. Yep. Well, people might be looking at some questions or formulating a question. Do you have any remarks about about anything that we were discussing, or anything maybe that we didn't discuss? We do have a question with regard to infrastructure, and this is a good question. Is action on infrastructure more or less likely with the new administration? I think that out of all the issues that could come up as priorities for Republicans and Democrats, this could be the sweet spot next year for legislation. There will be pressure, to get something done, quote, right? That phrase, to get something done together. And infrastructure could be the one that really unites them. Now, there will be a lot of polarization, I think, next year. So there will be some challenges, I think, with some of the relationships between Republicans and Democrats. But if they can put that aside, the fact that Biden is supportive of infrastructure, a significant amount of Republicans in the Senate would be, and the House would be very supportive of it. It kind of could be um, that that sweet spot to get something really more significant than some smaller type of legislation. So yeah, I think that it's probably more likely, but I'm going to add the caveat that as long as they can play nice with each other. But yeah, out of all the issues, this would be the one um, I think that has the best chance. All right, I'll just wait another second here before we close out, just see if there's any other questions. Oh, there's Jeff. Jeff, do you have any other remarks about just what we were covering, or anything we didn't cover? Just any concluding thoughts?
No, I wanted to thank you and Government Affairs Committee again for all their work this year. We still are working towards finalizing an alliance with OSHA. We hope to have that here at the beginning of the new year. We've been working diligently on that over the last year and a half. So we look forward to hosting OSHA, at least on our podcasts in the future, and continuing our relationship with them. And again, thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Alex, for putting this all together. And thank you all for joining us today on this important topic.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I hope the information was useful. And I think, just as a quick note for next year, I'd like to do some more webinars next year for members. So be on the lookout for some announcements in 2021 regarding webinars for government affairs. We'll put some of those together for next year. So we'll see you then, and thank you again for joining us.